There's been a surge of news about our southern border lately because, well, there's been a surge at the border, especially with the dropping of Title 42. Some estimates put the figures of migrants coming across the border at 20,000 a month. And while the focus is on the amount of migrants coming, there's less talk about who in the crowd might be a victim of trafficking. This is because Border Patrol has to learn who the migrant person is first before they can even begin to understand if the person is a victim. Human trafficking at the border is rampant. Why? Because cartels can make more money off of people than off of drugs, even a drug like fentanyl. What we do know about human trafficking, not just at the southern border but worldwide, is that trafficking can be done on a one-to-one, or on cell phones, or via text, or email, or even in codes. Innocent victims are lured into the business often through social media, where the connection for them seems very much on the up and up. An important point: human trafficking robs millions of victims of their freedom, their health, their dignity, and it can threaten peace among nations. It is the preferred crime by transnational criminals and terrorists who take advantage of instabilities caused by natural disasters or warring nations or something like a pandemic. It's estimated that human trafficking worldwide involves about 25 million victims or more, and it happens in every region throughout the world. I'm Terry Gilberg, and this is Timeline with Terry. Today's Timeline topic: human trafficking is the business of human slavery. I'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Mike Lindell, CEO of MyPillow. Retailers, shopping channels, and now even banks have tried to cancel myself and MyPillow. During these times, your support has meant everything to us. My employees and I want to personally thank each and every one of you by passing the savings directly on to you. For example, you can get my Giza Dream bed sheets for as low as $39.99 a set. That's a savings of 60% and the lowest price in history. And remember, they're made with the world's best cotton, grown where the Sahara Desert, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Nile River all meet. They come with my 10-year warranty, and I guarantee they'll be the most comfortable sheets you'll ever own. So go to mypillow.com now and use the promo code on your screen, or call the 1-800 number below to get my Giza Dream bed sheets for as low as $39.99, the lowest price in history. If you do it right now, I'm also going to include a free gift with your purchase. Thank you, and God bless.
Paul, and I live in Columbia County in Evans, Georgia, and I wanted to thank you for your involvement in also getting the CTA TV station up, 49-4, because I only just discovered it about a week ago, and I've been watching it a lot ever since because I'm concerned about this nation, and Georgia have been since 2020 after the November 20 election. Knew something was definitely wrong. That didn't go down right. I watched the whistleblowers give their testimonies all over the United States with Rudy Giuliani and all his team, and I just can't believe that happened in America, and that then regular mainstream media just covered up the whistleblower testimonies. We watched them on our smartphones, and they just didn't replay them, and they didn't give them any credence. And anyways, I'm just glad y'all have a station going on, and I plan on continuing to watch you. Thank you so much.
And welcome back to Timeline with Terry. I'm Terry Gilberg. With trafficking, which is our subject today, there's always the element of debt bondage. As the victim becomes in debt to the trafficker, the bondage then begins. And there's a lot of tactics used to get to this relationship. Some even call it grooming tactics. And once bonded between the victim and the trafficker, in particular, there's high-level threats to keep victims enslaved. This is what we're going to talk about today to kick off our show. My guest today has gone deep down the rabbit hole of covert human trafficking. He is John Dyslin, who in his younger years was headed toward the NBA until he had a knee problem, almost a blow-up. But then he launched a career in investment banking, private equity, and strategic business development. He has served on many corporate boards, and he is also trained with covert forces and leaders in the fight against human trafficking. He is the author of Nehemiah Strong, which is a terrific book. It's a resource book that looks at today's current challenges and gives concrete answers to today's most pressing problems. Welcome to the program Timeline with Terry John. Nice to have you on the show.
Thanks, Terry. Pleasure
You're
to be
welcome.
here.
And I'm so glad you came into the studio. So let's get right to it while we have the time. 4 areas known in the world for human trafficking include India, China, Mexico, and Africa. As I said in the open, if you're a trafficker, they would say we're in the business of bodies. Bodies, all right? Bodies that can make money through any means possible, whether it is through physical labor, sex slavery, prostitution, harvesting of organs as well, which is rampant in China, or through bodies that become mules for the drug lords. So I want to ask you just right at the top, what was your area that you studied when you studied and worked in covert human trafficking?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here with you. My focus had to do with satanic ritual abuse and general human trafficking that was primarily focused not so much on the drug trade, but on sex trafficking. And so it was 2 parts. One was primarily underage women who were caught into the cycle of prostitution in metro markets in the Southeast, but then also satanic ritual abuse oriented trafficking up more in the Northeast, in particularly the Amish and Mennonite communities of Pennsylvania.
Wow. Wow. And I would assume before you get to SRN, satanic ritual abuse, you've got to have the victims that get into that. So that's where the victims are trafficking.
Yes.
We don't hear a lot about SRN with the general discussion of human trafficking. So you bring that particular aspect to the conversation, right?
Yeah, and it's it's a hard subject, Terry, because the more you learn, the more you almost wish you didn't know, and it's a situation where the best cover, and I'm going to say some stuff that might shock some people, but the best cover for something like satanic ritual abuse and human trafficking oftentimes are institutions that present themselves as a part of the solution. So, for example...
and noble and good and doing the right thing.
Yes. Yes. So, for example, I came to know a woman who very graciously shared some behind-the-scenes understanding about an operation in Haiti. So it presented itself as an orphanage for young orphan boys. What it was human trafficking of the young boys, but the cover was an orphanage. And so I think one of the challenges that human traffickers face is, for example, what am I doing with all these kids? And so unfortunately a terrific cover for that is to actually present yourself to be part of the solution, i.e. an orphanage, or providing services for, let's say, bringing orphaned children to the United States, but the end result is awful and tragic and horrid. And for example, the gentleman running that trafficking operation out of Haiti was trafficking boys to America and to Americans in Haiti, but then also was presenting himself in churches in America fundraising as an orphanage.
Well, if you're into satanic ritual abuse, what better cover than an orphanage?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
All right. How widespread is SRA, would you say?
It is shockingly pervasive.
Really?
It is everywhere. It is in the town we're in now. It's in small town America. It's consistent, for example, with Freemasonry. And so For example, there are over 30,000 Freemason lodges in America. I've been in the tiniest towns with the most comical rural names of these towns down here in the South where I live, and every one of them has a lodge, and activities like that follow along with Freemasonry, but also under other covers. For example, in the Mennonite Amish communities, which present themselves as wholesome and rural and grounded in the land and farming and all these wholesome appearing things, but underneath that thin veneer is a multi-generational practice where upwards of 85% of the adolescent and teen girls in the communities are ritualistically raped. They're videoed, and the videos are sold.
It reminds me a little of the FLDS community up in Colorado City, Arizona, and that, of course, has been busted up. It's a little sidebar.
Yeah.
Would you say that satanic ritual abuse and the trafficking is more with children, or more with teens, or any kind of victim, a woman, a man, anyone that sort of gets sucked into that and then lives for the abuse?
The model within those communities was certainly focused on the adolescent and teen. Obviously,
So that's more common, that age group.
Within those communities, yes. And so the model of the abuse was to start in adolescence and teen years, and then not continue as much into the adult years.
If an adult is abused, but then, as the saying goes, likes what they're used to, there's that saying, do you find that adults might be then the abuser? Might stay in the cult or stay in the group, wherever it is, at an orphanage or something, and then become the abuser?
Yes, very much so. And
Yeah.
so the groomed becomes the groomer. And we've all read about stories about things like Axios, where someone starts in innocently enough, gets sucked in, becomes, and the whole concept of grooming is to rechannel and really reprogram that person. It's a cult function. And so that person then becomes reprogrammed, if you will, and then unfortunately, more than a little, more often than we'd certainly like, they become part of the problem, because then they become part of the system and they play their role in whatever it might be, to perpetuate the vicious cycle.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. You like what you're used to. So if you're used to trauma, it's the Stepford wives, I think that was the example that's often given.
Stockholm syndrome.
Excuse me, the Stockholm syndrome, not the Stepford wives. I had my S's mixed up.
That's a different cult.
That's right. I had my S's mixed up. All right, what do we know about the kinds of cases of SRA from the authorities I have interviewed? Here's what they have to say. They say a person who says that they've survived SRA trauma many years ago will report many years in the future sometimes to an FBI agent, maybe a person like you that's working with authorities, the following things: bizarre demands of them, like drinking blood, eating flesh, being part of a ritual, perhaps dancing in the woods, engaging with a dead animal's body, killing animals, maybe like a grasshopper, or even mutilating a dog or a cat. Standing in a circle, they report holding a dagger, wearing robes, and the like. Okay, so the problem with criminal investigators that I've interviewed, and I'm going to pose the question to you and tell me if you agree with them, is that some of this behavior, holding a dagger, is not criminal. Okay? Killing a grasshopper is not really criminal. Kids do it, right, as part of play sometimes. So some of it is not criminal. It may be morally abhorrent. It may be spiritually, from a Christian point of view, terribly sinful. But the criminal investigator says a lot of this stuff, which makes your job harder, is not the stuff of felonies. It just isn't. And because you look down and you say, well, he danced in a circle in the woods, carrying maybe a baton of fire. Okay, where in the criminal statutes does it say that's a felony? It doesn't. All right. So for this reason, it becomes difficult to investigate the behavior as a crime. John, elaborate on that, if you will.
The things that you spoke to are the very most thin veneer of the top of what goes on in these circles. They don't stop with the dagger. The dagger goes into a child. They don't stop with a grasshopper. It goes on to a toddler. The crimes that go on are very much felonies, and the dressed up version, the shareable version of what we just talked about is certainly true, but that's the cover for the despicable acts that, as it says in Scripture, can't even be spoken of because they're so despicable. I'm not going to put them out on the air on your family program. But they're worse than most of your viewers could imagine or would want to imagine.
When you got into the study and indeed the investigation of human trafficking, did you also investigate other sides of human trafficking, like the drug mules, the border, children working in a mine, for example, in Africa? Not that you've been to Africa, but there's these facets of it. And it's all, as I said in the open and at the top, it's all human slavery. It's modern human slavery. I should punctuate, modern.
Yep. But it's been going on for all time, right? I mean, slavery is talked about in the Bible from 3,000 years ago, right? The Israelites were slaves in Egypt. So that's how it predates that. The difference here is that we purportedly live in a nation with rights and a constitution, and those slaves have rights, but those rights are being despicably trampled. And but back to your question, the focus in the area we were at, Pennsylvania is not near a border, at least the southern border. There isn't a mine per se, but what is being mined, figuratively speaking, are these precious adolescent girls in the community that get sucked into the whirlwind of trafficking and ritualistic rape, multi-generational, and that was bad enough. And there was more there than we could wrap around.
How did your investigation and indeed your travels get you up into the Amish community? That's a hard community to penetrate, I would imagine.
It started with a really precious woman who'd had enough and had the courage to reach out to...
And come forward.
Yes, exactly. And so she reached out to a gentleman named Russ Dizdar, who was a leader in our SSIU investigatory group, and it started with a crack. It started with tiniest little crack, almost like how a dam would break.
Did she run away, call the local police, call the sheriff's department? How did she become the crack?
She had heard transmissions like this one from Russ talking about such activities, because he had spoken of those things in a much more general sense, talked about satanic ritual abuse, multi-generational
on
satanic
a television
activity,
program or a radio
podcasts
program?
through Spotify and other platforms, and reached out, and then through that it became very apparent that it wasn't a one-off situation. It was pervasive. It was throughout the communities. And once that happened and it started getting talked about, which is what I love about this program, we're talking about it. Once it got talked about and opened, then other women started feeling comfortable coming forward, and then the floodgates opened.
Okay, let's take our first break. John Dyslin is with me here on Timeline with Terry. We are talking about the slavery, because that's the operative word. And maybe another operative word is modern slavery, known as human trafficking. I'll be right back on Timeline with Terry. Stick around.
Hello, I'm Mike Lindell, CEO of MyPillow. Retailers, shopping channels, and now even banks have tried to cancel myself and MyPillow. During these times, your support has meant everything to us. My employees and I want to personally thank each and every one of you by passing the savings directly on to you. For example, you can get my Giza Dream bed sheets for as low as $39.99 a set. That's a savings of 60% and the lowest price in history. And remember, they're made with the world's best cotton, grown where the Sahara Desert, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Nile River all meet. They come with my 10-year warranty, and I guarantee they'll be the most comfortable sheets you'll ever own. So go to mypillow.com now and use the promo code on your screen or call the 1-800 number below to get my Giza Dream bed sheets for as low as $39.99, the lowest price in history. If you do it right now, I'm also going to include a free gift with your purchase. Thank you and God bless.
Paul and I live in Columbia County in Evans, Georgia, and I wanted to thank you for your involvement and also getting the CTA TV station up 49-4 because I only just discovered it about a week ago, and I've been watching it a lot ever since because I'm concerned about this nation, and Georgia have been since 2020 after the November 20 election. Knew something was definitely wrong. That didn't go down right. I watched the whistleblowers give their testimonies all over the United States with Rudy Giuliani and all his team, and I just can't believe that happened in America, and that then regular mainstream media just covered up the whistleblower testimonies. We watched them on our smartphones, and they just didn't replay them, and they didn't give them any credence. And anyways, I'm just glad y'all have a station going on, and I plan on continuing to watch you. Thank you so much.
Welcome back to Timeline with Terry. I'm Terry Gilberg, your host. This is the show that goes deep and broad with experts, and we peel the onion back of the story to get to the sweet spot and a lot of the bullet points for you. It is not a soundbite show. It is a deep dive interview. And with me today is John Dyslin. He is a former, and maybe a little bit even today, covert human trafficking authority. He has worked with other authorities to try to break this cycle of human trafficking, particularly with satanic ritual abuse. I was reading on the work of former famed, and you might know this name, John, famed FBI agent Kenneth Lanning back in 1992. Do you know that name?
I do not.
All right. He talked about satanic or the occult activity and really burrowed in on it. I mean, he's an FBI agent, and he was one of the few at the time that really started to work heavily in this particular subset of trafficking. He laid out a lot of crime because he's looking for the crime so that he can build a case. Vandalism, destruction of churches and cemeteries, and this is worse crime than the crime we were talking about in the earlier segment. Thefts from churches and cemeteries, teenage gangs and the crime they get into, animal mutilations, I mentioned before, teen suicide, child abuse, kidnapping, murder, and human sacrifice, including abortion on a table where that table worships Satan. All right? Valid evidence, he says, shows that some connection between Satanism and the occult and the first 6 problems set forth above. There's evidence. Robbing from a grave, for example, that's robbery, right? So he can document that and start to build a case. But the connection to the last 3 problems, and the last 3, murder, human suicide, sacrifice, child abuse, much less certain, in fact, far from certain, because it's hard to get into the spot or into the event or into the fake facade like an orphanage would be, you mentioned in the first segment. So you got to penetrate into that, and therefore it's really hard to build the case with the most egregious crimes. Did you find that to be true?
Absolutely. And so, for example, much of what goes on in the woods, they're hypersensitive to being caught. They're not stupid. They're just evil. And so when they do the very most despicable things that they do, it tends to be in extremely controlled situations. So, for example, if you conduct a human sacrifice with a baby, if the baby was born in a barn and was never documented as a birth, then did the murder happen? If the baby never had a name, did that unnamed baby ever happen?
Right.
That's right. So the situations are controlled in such a way that producing verifiable evidence that can be taken to a prosecutor, taken to a grand jury, taken to a jury is exceedingly difficult.
Few and far between,
Yes.
probably. So a lot of these cases fall through the cracks.
Yes.
And that reminds me of another term that he used in some of his earlier work called birthing mothers.
Yes.
If the
Breeders.
Breeders. I thought it was birthing mothers.
Either.
Okay. Breeders, that's a better word. The idea, at least to my understanding, please elaborate, is that a woman who's involved in all of this, and probably as culpable as the men, would get pregnant and breed and breed and breed and breed for the purpose of that baby being sacrificed.
Correct.
Correct?
Yes.
Elaborate on that.
So it's, I mean, I hate to use this analogy, but it's almost like the woman is lowered to the level of a farm animal. So much like you would have a sow that would breed piglets, you've got this woman, and in a particular case that's rattling around my mind right now, it was on a farm in a barn. And so...
So this is a real example you're talking about.
Yes. And so this woman, these women don't necessarily live in the barn, but the babies that are born, they're not born in a hospital. There's not a certificate of live birth. There's not a name. They don't go into the system. And so because they're not in the system, there's no record. It's as if the person doesn't exist. And so then that baby is particularly available for a human sacrifice because there's no record. You know, it's like a tree falling in the wood if nobody's there to hear it. You know, did it make a sound? If that baby's screaming, you know, as it's being sacrificed on this table to Satan, and no one ever knew its name or it ever had a name, then did it ever happen?
Did it ever happen?
Yeah.
Did you have a personal experience with this kind of thing when you penetrated an Amish community in Pennsylvania?
My experiences in those communities were much more focused on the sexual trafficking and ritualistic rape of the adolescents and the teens, as opposed to the human sacrifice. But it's all woven into the same fabric, and so it would be a stretch for me to say yes, I knew that they were doing such things in those communities
Because you didn't see it per se.
Didn't see it and didn't hear of it. But it's all of the same cloth. You know, I'm not sure someone is less culpable if they're involved in multi-generational, you know, rape and trafficking of the adolescent girls in their communities. But still,
the authorities have to build a case.
Correct.
So you have evidence. You have to have that evidence.
And then, of course, a vital piece of evidence in those communities was these women coming forward and talking about what had happened. The stories were incredibly consistent. The same names kept coming up over and over. You're talking about grandfathers and then sons and then the daughters. And it just, you know, mind-blowing for somebody who couldn't conceive of doing such a thing. But then you're also living, you know, those girls are living in some of the most insular, isolated communities in America. And so the pressure, even when they came out, you know, for that woman who lives in an Amish or Mennonite community to come out and go before a grand jury and give testimony is so, you know, it's just, and then the peer pressure, and then the so-called Christian pressure to forgive and to let bygones be bygones and to go on.
And it cycles again.
Yes, exactly.
Well, it seems to me that the collaborative experience of several women coming forward makes for far more explosive testimony and evidence for authorities. It's not just one person that says it, it's multiple women or multiple young boys, etc. True?
True. Now, so to continue on, you have to consider that the enemy has been at this for a very long time. And when I say the enemy, I'm talking about in the spiritual realm now. So I'm talking about Satan, I'm talking about his minions, I'm talking about the demonic realm, the spiritual realm. And so for example, if you put your strategic cap on for a moment, if you were working the very most wicked, despicable things in society, wouldn't you want to have your flanks covered? So for example, while I have several friends who are in law enforcement who are terrific, and most folks in law enforcement and also prosecutors I'm friends with. Most of them are terrific. However, the enemy has infiltrated. It's pervasive. And so when I say it's pervasive, the crime, but also the protection of the crime is pervasive too. And so I know of individuals who are in various levels of law enforcement and on the prosecutorial side who will turn a blind eye to such things, no matter how despicable or illegal they may be. They don't get the focus, they don't get prosecuted, they don't get pursued as other crimes do.
So some of the good guys are bad guys.
Of course. And it has always been that
And
way.
their motivation is money, usually. But in the Amish community, where is the money exchange?
That's a good question. It's you can't have a big 4x4 in the Amish community, right? So it's different that way. One would think, who lives sort of, I'll say, in the normal realm, that money would be the motivator. I think you're underestimating how much evil for evil's sake is a motivator. And so the conducting of the evil is a magnificent thrill for, I would argue, for many of the folks who are involved.
For its own sake.
Yes.
And that's part of the cult brainwashing, I would imagine.
Yes.
Right?
Well, and in a peculiar way, it's hard for me to even say these words, but even let's say the fathers, and when I say adult men trafficking adolescent girls, these include their own daughters. It's not someone else's daughter. It's the granddaughter trafficked by the grandfather. So, but what I was going to finish my point, as hard as it is to accept, the father and the grandfather who are involved in this, they are victims too. You know, they're conducting this ritual, they're perpetuating this thing, but they're caught in this vicious cycle.
Yes.
And as much as it pains me to say it, I need to have a heart, because they're as lost as these daughters that they suck into this ritualistic cycle too.
And when you talk about trafficking in a tight community like the Amish or the Mennonite, is the trafficking through other brothers, uncles, anybody that wants to participate? Or are they also trafficked outside of the community into modern society? Philadelphia, for example,
Yeah.
New York City.
Yeah.
Yes?
There's some of that goes on.
Wow.
It's so insular of a community that a great deal of the trafficking is cycling within the community itself, because they don't have the degree of relationships outside their community that, say, you or I would have in our neighborhood or down the street or in another city. So there's a lot of it that is taking place within the community, and of course, because they all know of this practice and they've been around this practice for many years, there's a level of familiarity, and so there's less risk of being caught because they know one another. But then there is also some degree of outside trafficking as well, but it tends to be much more insular because of the nature of the communities.
Right.
Themselves.
And that we find that true wherever it is, Africa, Thailand, South America, Mexico, wherever it is.
Mm-hmm.
What organizations or agencies did you work with that are authority figures, FBI, CIA, local sheriff, local police? And how did you link up with the agency that you linked up with?
We worked with, I'd rather not be completely specific with all of this. We worked with
Fair enough.
state police, highway patrol. We worked with inter-agency task forces.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to keep in mind the enemy enemy gets to infiltrate too. And so, like I spoke to earlier, I'm aware of a particular meeting with a particular task force in a particular state where an individual at the table made it very clear during a moment that they were not playing, they were not a white hat. Let's put it that way. But there they were in the midst of this task force. And so the infiltration is going on too. And so one's ability to make headway is challenged and is hamstrung to a significant degree by
What did you think or do at that moment when the so-called white hat has a dark hat on?
What can you do?
Well, what did you do? Did you
I
try to
was
blow
not
his
at that
cover?
meeting.
Did you try to blow your cover?
Yeah, I was not at that meeting. My compadre Russ Dizdar was in that meeting.
I see.
There's not much to do. The reveal was so subtle that it wasn't really an accusable moment, but it was very clear, and it was just a little tell to say, hey, we're everywhere, and they are.
Yeah, and they're tempted, like any other person might be tempted as well, right?
Well, I'd say beyond tempted, because they have turned themselves over in an active way to conducting some of the
And
most
probably
despicable
making
acts.
money, right?
Yeah.
All right. Another quick break here on Timeline with Terry. I'm Terry Gilbert. We're talking about modern human slavery, otherwise known in the parlance as trafficking. It's all about the bodies, and a lot of times the traffickers make more money on the bodies of people than they even do in the drug trade. I'll be right back. You're watching Timeline with Terry. I'm Terry Gilbert, your host, and on the topic today, because we bring you a Timeline topic every single day, Monday through Friday. Topic today is on human trafficking. You've heard a lot about it, but did you know an aspect of human trafficking is satanic ritual abuse, which you probably haven't heard a lot about because you probably don't want to hear a lot about it. My special guest for this hour has been talking with me about it. John, let me segue now from SRA specifically to what you think of the investigative police force out today. For example, the public used to have a lot of trust in the FBI, but that has waned. The DOJ, for example, that has waned. CIA, for example, that has waned. Largely, I think, because of who's running the agencies. Not the field agent, not the local agent out there in Denver or Dallas or Boston or wherever, but the head of the agencies. The everyday officer, he or she is doing his or her job. Same with police, same with sheriff's department. There are always bent cops, always, and we were talking about that right before the break. The majority are clean. We need to acknowledge that on a program like this, trying to do their jobs. But we also have the tug-of-war, I think, with this idea of defund the police. So on the one hand, you've got some bent cops at the top, and we know that now through a lot of other investigations. For example, the John Durham investigation that is now out for public consumption. And we've got the everyday cop that's out there doing the best that he can, either as an investigator or as a beat cop or whatever he or she is doing. But then you've got the tug over with, well, but defund the police. We don't want any of that. How do you process all of that? Because it's rather confusing. What would you say about that?
Yeah, my first point, and just to reiterate something you just said, because I've got multiple friends who are, policemen, they're military, former military, they're, three-letter agency type folks, and the great majority of the everyday working in the field operatives, detectives, officers, what have you, are good folks, salt of the earth folks. I met one this weekend, and just the most terrific man. He was police chief in a town in Alabama, and so by and large, the rule is that they are fine men and women serving their community, serving our nation. it's the exceptions, and as you noted, to use a turn of phrase, fish rots from the head down. And at the head, particularly at those agencies you just mentioned, there is rot at the top. They're appointed. They didn't come up through the system. And the weaponization, if I could be so bold, of things like the FBI, the CIA, the DOJ, has rendered them to the point where it's hard to argue for their continued going on, particularly the FBI and the CIA, because how can you fix them? They're so rotten at the top. How do you fix them other than just dissolving them?
Well, here's a way that I'm hearing might be fixed. Speaking of defund the police, now we're hearing defund the FBI.
Absolutely.
Which are the federal police and the most noted throughout history as the best in the world. Now, what have we today? We have a movement now, even some in Congress saying, defund the FBI. Or, if that can never happen, and I personally don't think it will happen, but break up the FBI from Washington, D.C., and scatter the departments all over the United States. So it's not right there, right across the street from the DOJ, right looking at Pennsylvania Avenue, which looks down to Congress, right there in the hub where all of this, shall I say, kibitzing can happen, working with the DOJ, who are we going to prosecute, who are we not. And as they went on, as we know now through the John Durham report, prosecuting political enemies rather than prosecuting and working with people like you on real crime, because that was a made-up hoax. I don't want to digress too much on that, but the people are mad. I know, I interview them all the time. They are mad, and this movement of defunding the FBI is now about. Yep. Smart move?
I would argue yes. You know, and here's
Really?
Here's the challenge. The enemy, I'll say the enemy, you know, Satan and his minions, the wicked who are active in the world, they would, first of all, I would argue that an institution like the FBI is a captured institution. It's captive, and it's so captive that in recent years it's become brazen in how outrageously it will violate its own tenets, and the particularly the people at the top and their minions who are working with them will violate their oaths regularly, so regularly that they don't even think about it
And it becomes
anymore.
commonplace now.
Yes, and so it's actually using the office, their office, and the institution they work in to further evil interests that are actually 180 degrees counter to the very charter of the organization they work in. And the examples are replete.
Would you go so far to say they're another orphanage?
Absolutely.
Really?
It's a cover. It's a cover. It's a veneer of integrity and righteousness, if I could use that term, for something like law enforcement. But underneath the machinations and the evidence that repeatedly is coming out, the proof is in the pudding. You judge a tree by its fruit. The fruit of that tree is utterly poison for years. And think about even the roots of it. Herbert Hoover, the stories that have come out about Hoover, and the very building is named the Hoover Building.
That's true.
They're proud of it. And
Fair
the stories about his despicable behavior in office as the original director are legion.
Let's switch gears. I mentioned in the open, you're the author of, look at this volume. And it's heavy too. How many pounds is this?
It's 4 pounds.
Full of information. Nehemiah Strong, life-sustaining essentials for a season of trial. Wow. How do I begin to describe this? You look out, would this be fair to say, on the horizon of current events, and you go, we got a lot of problems. And a lot of them are moral and social and cultural problems. To be sure, we got political problems. We got problems of war and peace, and United States sending all kinds of ammunition to Ukraine, and yet we're not in a war, but we kind of are the proxy. There's a lot of stuff out there. Men are women, women are men, people are pronouns. I mean, we don't have time for the transgender discussion, but you address many of these in this resource book. which is extremely impressive. You go
Thank
back
you.
to biblical, tried and true answers to life's most pressing problems. And as I went through this, I noticed that about a fourth of the book has to do with the coronavirus. This is a very contempo book. Why did you then go from all of that survival techniques and make sure if we don't have enough food because there might be, I don't know, a power outage? You know, we have 3 grids in the United States. They're all vulnerable. Eastern grid, Texas grid, and Western grid. So you got to get your tuna fish and your batteries and your water all in your storage. But then you switch gears to COVID and how to cope post-COVID. Let's talk about that for a minute. Why did you go there when the COVID thing is still being argued and the vax thing is still being argued? Is that why? Because it is, in fact, still being argued?
Well, in the genesis of the book, Terry, what I felt was, and isn't it funny how there's no new thing under the sun. You know, what has been will be, and what is has already been.
And human behavior doesn't really change.
No, that's a constant.
That's
and
a
so
constant.
what I recognized, Terry, was that we live in a season unlike any other that anyone living could remember. Even our oldest, our great-grandmothers, great-grandfathers. We're living in a season when the enemy, as Isaiah wrote 2,700 years ago, the enemy's coming in like a flood. And he goes on to say, when he does, the Spirit of the Lord shall raise up a standard against him. That's in the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament. And I was moved to respond to that and try and strive to answer the question, because I was asking the question myself, what do I do now?
What is the answer
Yeah.
to this crazy world that we live in?
Yeah.
Where left seems right, right seems left, good seems evil, evil seems good.
Yes.
And like I say, men are women, women are men, and people are pronouns.
Yes.
It's an upside down, inside out issue, problem on many issues.
Yes.
And what I think is that the enemy is confusion. In World War II, we knew who the enemy was. It was Nazi Germany. Okay. Today, a lot of people don't know who the enemy is because they're confused, or they look at truth as their truth and they think they're on the moral high ground. And your truth is the enemy. So we've got confusion even in what is true. Reminds me of Pontius Pilate with Christ. Well, what is truth? He says to Jesus. Am I right?
Well, now he asked it rhetorically, thinking
Sure
there was
he
no
did.
answer.
Sure.
He was
Sure he
little
did.
did he
And yet
know
he's
he was standing with the man who
with the
was
truth.
the truth, right? So I do think it's important to note that, as a good friend of mine, Coach Dave Daubenmeier, has said, truth sounds like hate to those who hate the truth. Now, the truth isn't actually hate, but it's so detestable to those who have believed the lie.
It's a good way of putting it.
I believe them. It feels like hate. When they say hate speech, I believe them that it feels like hate speech, even though, as a Christian, I would come to them in love and understanding that they're captive, just like the satanic ritual abuse folks we were talking about just a moment ago. So the corrosion of truth, the erosion of a principle of absolute truth, well, that's just another device of the enemy. And so when I say the enemy's coming in like a flood, the flood comes from everywhere. The flood is pervasive. The flood comes up through the sewers.
And we are today overwhelmed, I think.
Yep.
Look at young people, they're overwhelmed. We're in communication overload. They're on their pads, they're on their iPhones, they're on their speakers in their headphones. They're getting information from all over the place. And many of them are confused.
And yet, isn't it amazing, Terry, how we get more information than ever, and yet it's as if we understand less than ever before.
Bingo. I would agree with that.
If I think of our fathers, our grandfathers, our grandmothers too, mothers, they understood the world. They understood life. They had common sense walking around. They knew what a woman was. They could have answered that question
They could have been
for
on
the
the Supreme
Senate.
Court.
That's right. They qualified better. So, but here's the thing. I would really impress this to your audience who's listening. You have to have a spiritual framework, or otherwise the world that we're living in increasingly will make you mad. And I think that's by design. You have to understand that this war that's raging, this battlefield that we are all on, whether you want to recognize that or not, it starts in a spiritual framework, in the spiritual realm. And if you can understand that, and you can start with, okay, it's a battle of good and evil. Mm-hmm. It's a battle of God and Jesus Christ and their enemies, their sworn enemies.
But for people who don't have that faith life, or even any belief system, they will lean on the government, they will lean on, the environment, they will lean on other social mores that they think to be true,
Yes.
because they really don't have that.
Yes.
Final thoughts, we have to wrap up.
Final thought is, to finish out that point, you have to find a grounding in faith. You have to find a grounding in the spiritual realm. Once you do, everything else will make sense. But until you do, none of it will.
Mm-hmm. John Dyslin, nice to have you on the program with all your insights. Here is the book, Nehemiah Strong. How do people get the book?
You can go to johndyslin.com. That's JOHNDYSLIN.com, or on Amazon, and just look for Nehemiah Strong. Life-sustaining essentials for a season of trial.
And we got to some of those today on the show.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for being with us. That's another wrap with Timeline with Terry. I'm your host, Terry Gilbert. Visit our website, Conservative Television of America, and get another Timeline topic tomorrow, as we have one every single day. I'll see you then.